Hey everyone, and welcome back to Daily Tuition. In this short course, we will be look at React hooks and understand React hooks in detail with example. We're also going to look at the latest hooks which are included in React 18. Let's dive in and see the first React hook, which is useState. useState is the React hook useful when you want to update DOM value. With useState, you can preserve the variable value between functions call. So let me show you a very simple example. I'm going to create here a function. I'm simply going to create here a function app, and then I'm going to export this function. So I'm going to say here export default app, and inside this function I'm going to call the useState hook. To call the useState hook, you need to first import that. So at the top you have to say import useState and call from React. But this statement is going to return an error. This is because useState is not a default export just like this from the React library. Instead, you have to call here an object, and inside that object you have to put this useState. So that once you put the useState inside an object, because this is not the default export, now you can call this useState inside your application. So to call useState in your application, you have to say constant in the array, you specify the name for the state, or let me simplify this, just specify the name for your variable. So we specify name for this variable name. You can specify any name to this variable, that's upon you. And to this array, you also specify the setter function. It means the function which allows you to update the value of this name variable. So we specify here function name set name. That's upon you. You can specify any name here. So let's suppose that you want to specify here name use name, then that completely fine. Just out of that, we specify here equal to sign, and then say here use state. Then inside this parenthesis, you specify the initial value to this name variable. This name variable is just like the normal JavaScript variable, but with this useState, you can update the value of this name variable with this function. So let me first specify the initial value to this name variable. So just for now, I'm going to specify here initial value daily. Just out of that, I'm going to say here return, and inside this return, I'm simply going to call a division tag with app class, and then I'm going to print a paragraph here. And then I'm going to say here channel name is, and this curly braces, I'm going to print this name variable. And I save the changes, you can see I'm going to get here response channel name is daily. This is going to print this initial value inside this paragraph. But what if you want to update this value? To update this value, you need to create a function. So whenever you click on that function, you can update the value of this name variable. To do that, let me create a button just out of this paragraph. Right down here, I'm going to create a button and specify onClick handler function to it. The handler function name is change name. You can specify any name here, that's upon you. And to this button, we specify text click me. So when you click on this onClick button, I'm going to execute this change name handler function. Let me copy this and create this function. Otherwise, you will get an error message. So here I'm going to say constant change name is equal to, and this is a type of function. So we pass here function statement. Just out of that here, whenever you click on this click me button, I want to update the value of this name. So to update the value of this name, we have here a function called setName. You can call this setName right inside this change name. And then inside the parentheses, you specify the value to this name variable. So as you know, the initial value is daily. We can change this value by specifying here double quote and specify here tuition. And I save the changes. And when I click on this click me, you can see it's going to change the value of this state. Now let's suppose by using this click me, you want to toggle this initial and this specified value. In that case, instead of specifying this initial value to this useState, you specify here true. And inside this set name, here you specify name. Now inside this name, we have true value, this one. And then we specify here question mark, and then specify here in a double quote daily and the false value, which is tuition. I'm going to call here ternary if and else condition. So if you have true inside this name variable, specify daily this name. Otherwise, specify tuition. But you can notice this statement is going to change the initial value of the state. If I try to click on this button again, it's not going to do anything. This is because now inside this name variable, instead of true, we have daily value. So to solve this problem, we can use this statement right here instead of this name. So we pass here name and the ternary if and else condition. And inside this set statement, we're just going to have name with exclamation mark. So whenever the value changes, I'm going to pass the inverted value to this variable. Now let me save this and click on this click me. You can see by clicking on this click me button, I can change the value of this variable. Now, because we use here exclamation mark, whenever I click on this change name, we are going to change this initial value with the new one. Because we have exclamation mark here, this exclamation mark is going to invert the initial value. So let's suppose that we have true inside this variable, then this exclamation mark is going to change their true to false. And then when we have false here, it's going to print this tuition value. Now you're not limited to specify only string or boolean values inside this use state. Instead, you can pass here object as well, something like this. You can specify here properties like first name, last name, and their values. And if you want to access these values, you need to update this name variable as well. So instead of just name, you need to specify the property value. So I'm going to copy this and then specify here dot and specify the property value. Now because this is an object, you need to call the property value with the name object. Let me save this, and you can see I'm going to have here daily because the first name initial value is daily. If I want to update this value, then right inside this set name, I'm going to pass an object and specify here first name and a new value, update it. Save this and reload the browser. Now when I click on this click me, you're going to get the updated value. But when I click on this click me again, you're not going to get anything. The reason behind this statement is going to reinitialize the state, and you're going to have only one property inside your name variable. Let me show you. If I console.log this, if I say console.log name, and if I open my console.log and click on this click me, you can see you're going to get here first name updated. This statement is going to update the previous state, and you're going to get a new state as a response. So this statement will work well, but it will remove the second property from the initial state, and you're going to lose your data. So to solve this problem, you have to preserve the object value in the use state. To do that, you can simply use here object.assign, or you can use the spread operator. Here I'm going to call an object because the initial value of the state is object. Then we specify the name. Right now inside this name variable, we have the default value of the state, which is going to be this value. We have two properties inside this name right now. Just out of that, I'm going to specify a comma and then pass the new value. So we specify here first name and updated value, this one. Now just out of that, before this name, you need to specify here spread operator. So you call here triple dot. Now this spread operator is going to combine this first name property with this object. So now when I save the changes and reload the browser, and when I click on this click me, it's going to first return the initial value of the state. And when I click on this click me again, you can see I'm going to get the updated value, which is this first name. If you want to update this second value, you can pass this last name right here. Save the changes, click on this click me. It's going to update the last value. Use state is also useful in the form as well. Let's suppose that we have here a use state with the initial value string. Then I'm going to call here a form, and inside that form, I'm going to have the input text box of the type text. Then to the value attribute, we specify this variable. And just out of that, to the onChange event, I'm going to call the handler function and then call this set name function. And inside that, I'm going to call event.target.value. Inside this value, we're going to have the value of this input text box. To access the current input text box value, I'm going to specify here target.value property. And at the end, I'm going to call the button and submit this value to the form using this change name handler function. Let me save the changes, and you can see I'm going to have the input text box and a button. Inside this handler function, I'm going to console.log name and say here e.preventDefault, and then call here event parameter because we are accessing this event parameter right inside this function. Let me save the changes and now clear this screen. Now whenever I specify anything inside this input text box, let's suppose that if I specify here daily tuition, then you can see I'm going to have my text right inside my browser. This is because I'm changing the value of the name variable using this set name handler function. Whenever I change anything inside the input text box, we are going to execute the onChange event handler, and we have the response inside this variable. Now if I try to click on this button, we get that value inside the console with this change name handler function. So I hope you understand the possible ways you can work with use state in the React application. Now once you understand the use state, let's understand the next React hook. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about a very important hook, which is useEffect. Understanding how the useEffect hook works is one of the most important concepts in React today, because React useEffect is a function that gets executed for 3 different React component lifecycle. So it means this function is executed in 3 different ways. The React lifecycles are component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. So let's get started and see how we can use the useEffect hook in the React application. So to understand useEffect hook, let me create a very simple example. So inside this React application, I'm going to simply first import the useEffect and useState from the React library. Now because useState is not a default export from React, I'm going to just import that inside this curly braces. After that, we create a function app, and inside this component, I'm going to simply call the useState. And to this useState, we specify, hi there, how are you? Just after that, inside this app, I'm going to call the useEffect hook. You can see how I call this useEffect hook. I'm going to call useEffect, and inside this parenthesis, I'm going to call the handler function. So the useEffect hook accepts a function as its first argument. This function handler will take care of any side effect you like when it gets run. So I'm going to call here a simple handler function inside this useEffect. Just after that, I'm simply going to return a division tag and a comment, and h1 heading tag with this comment value. Now let me save the changes and try to execute this. You can see inside the React application, you will get hi there, how are you? So you will get this value from this useState. Now when I open the console, then you can notice inside my console, I'm going to have here two statements. This is because we have React strict mode as a wrapper to the app component. If you back to the index.js of your React application, then you will notice here in the latest version, you're going to have a wrapper to your main app component. So if you remove this React strict mode right from here, something like this, then you're only going to get one statement as a response. You can see. Now this strict mode statement is going to activate the additional checks and warning for its descendant nodes, because app should not crash in the case of bad practice in the code. We can say strict mode is a safety check to verify the component twice to detect an error. Just for now, for this example, I'm going to remove that and I'm going to back to my example. So this is the exact result of useEffect. This will call the component did mount and you will get your response in the console. So whenever the component is mounted in the UI, you will get this message. If I reload the browser, you're going to get the same result, because when you reload the browser, the component gets mounted in the UI and you will get this response in the console. Every time the component gets mounted in the UI, the useEffect hook will going to execute. So this is the first way you can use useEffect hook in the React application. Let's talk about the next one. In the next one, you can use useEffect hook just like you use component did update in the React class component. Now let's suppose that you have reply button inside your UI, something like this. To this reply button, you have this handler function. And let me create this comment handler at the top. So right up here, just out of this useEffect, here I'm going to create that comment handler. Now let me save the changes and click on this reply. It's going to change the value of this UI. This is because when I click on this button, it's going to call this set command and change the value of this comment variable. But you can notice inside the console, you're also going to get this message, trigger useEffect hook. So this is also going to execute the useEffect hook. This is because behind the scene, useEffect hook is going to dispatch an action when there is a change inside the state or inside the component property. So useEffect hook will always execute when you change the state or the component properties. When we click on this on submit button, it's going to change the value of the state and then the useEffect hook is going to trigger. If you want to avoid this and execute useEffect hook only once when the component gets mounted, you can just pass second argument to the useEffect hook. For example, let's suppose that when you click on this button click, you don't want to execute this useEffect. In that case, you can pass here a comma and pass a second argument. You pass here empty array. Let me save the changes and show you the result first. Let me save this, load my browser. You can see the useEffect hook is now executed because the component is mounted in the UI. Just out of that, when you click on this button, you can see this is going to change the value of this comment, but it's not going to execute this useEffect hook. This is because we tell React that I don't want to execute this useEffect hook on any changes of React state and properties. Now just out of that, let's suppose you have two state in the component and you only want to execute useEffect hook when the first state changes. Let's suppose if I have another state with the variable comment2, set comment2 and some values here. And for the second command, I'm also going to have the handler function and a button. When you click on this reply to button, I'm going to execute this second handler function. Now this handler function is going to change the value of this comment2. And I'm also going to print this comment2 just out of this h1 heading tag. Now let me save the changes and show you the result. Let me reload the browser. Now when I click on this reply, it's going to change the value of this first comment like this. And when I click on this second reply, it's going to change the value of this second comment. But what I want when I click on this first reply button, I want to execute this useEffect hook. I only want to execute this useEffect hook when I click on this first button. So what we can do is we can pass this command to this array right here. So this is going to tell React that execute this useEffect hook whenever the value of this command changes. Let me show you the result. Save the changes, reload the browser. When I click on this reply to, it's not going to execute this useEffect hook. But when I click on this reply, you can see this is going to execute this useEffect hook. So this is the second React component lifecycle, which is component date update. Now let's talk about the third one, which is component will unmount. Let me create a very simple example inside this project. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create app component, and inside this, here I have useState with the value true. And inside this useEffect hook, I'm just going to console.log a message. After that, I have here a comment handler, and inside this return statement, I'm going to call div. If the command return true, then call this remove me component. Otherwise, do not return anything. This after that, we have here a button. When we click on this button, I'm going to change the value of this command using this handler function. And when I scroll down, you can see I have here a function, remove me. This is just a simple React component. When I save the changes, now when you execute this statement, it's going to trigger useEffect hook when the component is mounted in the UI. When you click on this reply button, it's going to change value of this state, and then the useEffect hook will also going to execute. But what I want, when the component is unmounted from the UI, I want to execute this useEffect hook. In that case, you need to return another function from this useEffect. So right inside this, here I'm going to return another function, something like this. And inside this function, I'm going to say console.log unmount. Let me save the changes. And now you can see when the component is mounted, you will get this response. But when I click on this reply button, you're going to get two responses inside the console. Let me explain this. This useEffect hook is not going to execute this console.log. Instead, it's going to execute this function because now the component is unmounted from the UI. So we will have this message unmounted. And then the useEffect hook is also going to trigger when the component is updated. So as you know, when you unmount some component from the UI, React need to update that current component. So in that case, the useEffect hook is going to execute this console.log message. So I hope you understand 3 different ways you can use useEffect hook in the React application. So I hope you understand how to work with the useEffect hook. Let's understand the next React hook. Now, once we understand the useEffect hook, let's talk about the React next hook, which is useContext. React useContext hook makes it easy to pass data throughout your app without manually passing props down to the tree. There are 3 main steps inside this hook. First, creating the context, then providing the context, and consuming the context. Let's suppose that you want to pass parent component value to the child component. For that, you create a parent component and pass property to it. And if you want to access this property in the child component, you have to call the child component and pass data to it. Now, this is what we call property drilling, or you can say prop drilling. Prop drilling can become an issue in itself because it's repetitive code. So what is the best way to fix this issue? To solve this, we can use useContext hook. UseContext is used when some data need to be accessible by many components at different nesting levels. So let's understand the useContext hook with very simple example. So inside this application, let's suppose that I have a constant variable at the top, right up here, with the value myContextValue. Now let's suppose that you want to pass this value to your child component. Instead of using prop drilling, we are using context API. So let's suppose that we have here a component, myComponent. And to this myComponent, I want to pass this value property. So let me first specify this myComponent right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use context API to pass value to all the descendant components. So at the top, right up here, I'm going to import 2 functions. First is create context and second is use context. As the name implies, the create context is used to create a context, and the use context is allow you to use the previous context value. So just after this import statement right down here, you can create your own context. So let me create here a context constant context is equal to and call this create context hook. And just after that, you specify here your default value. So I'm going to pass here default value. Now that's upon you. You can pass any value here. And just after that, you call this context inside your myComponent. So to call this, you need to use this useContext hook. So right down here, you call constant value is equal to use context and then pass this context value this one to this my component. And just out of that, as you know, inside this create context, we have this string default value. Now, if I save the changes, I'm going to get this default value as a response. If I change this to initial value, then I'm going to have that value right here. You can notice. Now, what I want to change this value and pass this app value, this parent component value to this child component. To do that, we are going to wrap this my component inside the context provider. The context provider is nothing but a simple wrapper to your app component. And using that provider, you can access the value of your parent component in any child component. So let me get rid of this my component right from here. And here I'm going to call new component. The component name is context.provider. And inside this you call your component. And just out of that, you need to pass this value to this provider. So you pass here value is equal to, and in the curly braces, I'm going to pass this value, this one. Now this statement is now going to change the default value. Now when I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have here my context value. Now I can access the app component value in my child component very easily. Now let's suppose that you want to pass this same value to your nested child element. You don't have to do anything. You have to just pass this statement in your nested child, and you can access that value inside your nested child component as well. So this is a very simple use of useContext. Now let's understand the real world example of useContext. Let's suppose that you want to create a store in your React application, which is accessible by all the components. What we're going to do is, inside the React application, I'm going to create store.js file. And inside that file, we're going to first import the React, useState, and create context. As you know, to create a context, you need to import that from the React library. Just out of that, as you can see in the app.js, we need to specify the initial value to this context. So inside the store.js, let me create a new object and specify initial value to it. So instead of just creating initial value, I'm going to say here constant initial state, or you can say value. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this variable, and then you specify here value. I'm going to specify object here like this, and then specify here property session, then specify here property token and username. As well as I also want to specify function to this initial state. So right down here, I'm going to call that function. So I'm going to call here get token, then pass a function to it. Now this function is used to access this token. I'm going to pass this initial state to this context. So let me just pass that right down here. I'm going to say constant theme context is equal to create context, this function, and then as initial value, we specify the initial state, this one. And just out of that, just out of this state, right down here, I'm going to create this provider, this one. So what I'm going to do is, instead of passing this provider to the app component, I'm going to create and export a function. So I'm going to say here export constant theme provider is equal to, and then pass here the component. And inside this component, I'm simply going to return the context provider. So I'm going to just call this wrapper context.provider. You don't need to call this context inside this store.js. Instead, as you can see, you name the context theme context. So instead of context.provider, now we call here theme context.provider, something like this. Using this theme context, you can access the provider. And just out of that, to this provider, I'm going to specify value. Instead of just passing the static value to this provider, what I'm going to do is, here I'm going to create a state. So I'm going to say here constant in the array, I'm going to say session, comma, set session is equal to use state. And then inside this use state hook, I'm going to say initial state dot session. So I'm going to just initialize this object to this session. And then I'm going to pass this value to this theme provider right here. So I'm going to pass here value in the object. I'm going to pass another object, something like this. And here I'm going to say session and set session. So I'm going to pass both these values to this object right here. So now I can access this state in any child component. And also I can change the value of the state using this set session function. So inside this theme context, instead of passing any component, I'm going to pass the children. So inside this parenthesis, here I'm going to call children, and then I'm going to pass that right here. So I'm going to say here children. We need to just wrap the app component inside this theme provider. Now at the bottom, you have to just export the default theme context. Once you export the theme context, just back to the home.js file. Now you can see I already have this home.js component inside this component folder. I'm going to open that. You have to create this file, and inside this file, let me just simply create a component. So I'm going to say here export default. The component name is home, and after that, inside this home, what I want to do is I want to access this use context as well as this state. So to access that, I need to first import here a statement. Inside this, I'm going to import the theme context. So I'm going to import this default theme context like this, and then import the initial state, this one. Just after that, let me add the import React at the top, and here inside this component, I'm going to call the return statement and return a simple division tag, something like this. Inside this div, I'm going to first create a button. So I'm going to call here a button, and to this button, I'm going to specify the onClick event on it. Let me specify function here, otherwise I'm going to get an error. So I'm going to specify here function home, and inside this, I'm going to return a division tag with a button with onClick event handler. And let me just create this event handler inside this home. So right here, I'm going to say function handle click, and then inside this function, I'm going to console.log the context state. So let me just get this context inside this home.js file. So to get that, what you have to do is you have to just call the use context inside this application. So at the top, you have to say import. In the object, you call use context from React, and then inside your component, you simply call constant. In the object, you say session and set session. As you know, you can access both these variables because we specify this to this provider. You can see. Now, just after that, once you have your session and set session, you can get this from the context. So to get the context, you need to use here useContext hook. And inside this useContext, you need to specify your context object. As you know, this is your context object. Just copy it and specify that here. You have this context object from this store.js file. Just after that, once you have your session, simply going to console.log this session and use this set session to change the value of this session variable. So I'm going to just see here set session, and then I'm going to specify the previous value first, and then specify the new value to this session. After that, let me just print this session. So inside this division tag right down here, I'm going to print authorized token session.token. Now when I save the changes, back to the app.js, and here we need to import that home.js file. Let me get rid of all this statement right from here. Now what you have to do is you have to just wrap your app component inside this theme provider. As you know, we specify name to this function theme provider. So I'm going to access that inside this app.js right up here. So I'm going to say here import. In the object, we specify theme provider from // specify component and specify the store.js file. And you have to just specify this theme provider right here, something like this, and then pass your home component. I'm going to say here import home from the component.home file, and you call that home right inside your app component. You don't need to pass any value to your theme provider because we already specify that inside the store.js. You can notice we already have the wrapper to the theme. So we just need to call this theme provider and then specify that to the parent component. So once we've done that, let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have the result something like this. So the authorized token is secret. As you know, inside the store.js, we have this authorized token secret. And now when I click on this button, it's going to change the value of this authorized token. You can see we have now new value. This is because in the home.js, we specify this token value, new value. And you can see inside the console, you will get the previous value, which is token secret username Tailwind. We change this value using this set session statement. So when we click on this button, I'm going to call this handle_click handler function, call this set session, and change the initial state of the context. Now, if you want, you can get the initial state from this initial state variable as well. This variable is going to allow you to access the initial state of your store. Next, we'll talk about the useReducer. Now let's understand the next React hook, which is useReducer, which is similar to the previous useContext hook. useReducer is one of the additional hooks that shipped with React 16.8, the alternative to the useState hook. The useReducer hook helps you to manage complex state logic in the React application. The useReducer hook is used to store and update states. Just like the state hook, it accepts the reducer as a first argument and initial state as a second argument. The hook then returns an array of two items. First is the state and second is the dispatch function. Now the initial state is nothing but a simple value the state is initialized with. Now let's suppose that you want to create this initial state. Then at the top here, you can create the initial state something like this. It is just an object with the initial value to your useReducer. Now let me just show you how you can create this reducer function. Right down here, I'm simply going to say function reducer and then specify here two parameters, state and action. The reducer is a pure function that accepts two parameters. First is state and second is action object. Depending on the action object, the reducer function must update the state and return a new state. So let's create this reducer function. I'm going to create here let new state and then I'm going to call here switch case, something like this. And then inside this, I'm going to say action.type. And then if the case is increased, then I'm going to specify value to this new state. And this is going to be the counter state.counter plus 1. Now inside this state parameter, we have the previous state value. For now, inside this state, we have this counter 0 because the initial state is this counter 0. Just out of that, this action is used to execute, or you can say change the value of the state. In useReducer, you can't directly change the value of the state. Instead, you have to use an action. Action used to change the value of the current state. So inside this state value, you have your current state. To change its value, you're going to call the current state plus 1 and then specify that value to the new state. And then you return that new state from this function. So just out of that, let me just call the default statement as well, something like this. And just after this switch case, right down here, I'm going to return the new state, this one. Now this is a very simple example of reducer. So if you want me to make the advanced tutorial on useReducer, then let me know in the comment section. Just for now, let's understand this action. Now this reducer function doesn't modify the state directly. Instead, it's going to get the help from the action parameter. So if the action parameter match with this case, only then this reducer is going to change the initial state. Otherwise, you'll get the previous state as a response. So this is how you can create the reducer function in useReducer. Now let me just wrap all these things and create a very simple example. Let me get rid of all these things right from here and create a very simple example of useReducer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create first the initial state. So initial state is going to be the count and 0. So I'm going to specify here an object and pass property to it, and value is going to be 0. Just out of that, just out of this function, right down here, I'm going to create here a function with the name reducer. And we pass here two parameters. As I said, you're going to have state and action to this reducer function. Just out of that, here you can call if or switch case. That's upon you. You can use any of these statements. I'm going to call here switch case. I'm going to call switch if the action dot type, and then I'm going to call here case. So we have here different cases. So if the action dot type is equal to increment, then we're going to call this case. And inside this case, here I'm going to call return statement and say count state.count plus 1. So I'm going to just increase the value of this count variable by 1 when we call the increment action. Let me do the same for the decrement. So let me copy this case and then specify that right here. And this is now for the decrement action. So we call here decrement. And then I'm going to just decrease the value by 1. So I'm going to call here minus 1. So using this state.count, I'm going to get the current state value and minus 1 from it. Just after that, we need to return the default value as well. So I'm going to say here default colon, then I'm simply going to return an error if there is a default value. Now you can see here, I didn't create any new state inside this reducer. Instead, I changed the current state and return that from this reducer. If you want, you can create new state, something like this, let new state, and then specify all your return statement to this new state, and then return that from this reducer. That's upon you. I'm not going to do that. We learned that in the previous example. Right now, I'm just going to return the current state from this reducer. Just out of that, right up here, as you can see, I already have the useReducer, and to this hook, we specify reducer function, this one, and specify the initial state, this one. And inside this statement, I'm going to call count, colon, and then specify here state dot count. You can see how I access the initial state. I'm going to call this state variable and call dot count, because to the initial state, we have this property count. So I'm going to access this count inside this division tag. Just out of that, here I'm going to create a button, and this is going to be the plus button. So when you click on this plus button, it's going to increase the value of this state. And then I'm going to call here on click, and then here I'm going to call the callback function. And just out of that, inside this callback function, I'm going to call this dispatch function. This dispatch function is going to use to change the value of the state, just like the use state. As a second parameter, you get the function which allows you to change the value of your state. So we call here dispatch, something like this. This is a type of function. So we pass here parentheses, and then inside an object, you specify your action type. So what I want to do is when I click on this button, I want to increase the value of the state. So the action type for increasing the value of the state is this increment. So inside this object, we specify type. We create a property called type, and then specify in the single quote increment. Now you can see we created a property here type, and we check that property using action.type. If it is equal to increment, then return a new state by adding 1 to it. Just out of that, let me do the same. So let me copy this statement and duplicate it, and then I'm going to pass here minus. And this is a type of decrement. So let me copy this action type decrement and specify that here. Now just out of that, make sure you import this useReducer at the top. So here you call import, in the object you call useReducer from React. Save this file, and you can see you're going to have your application. And now when you click on this plus button, it's going to increase the value of the state by 1, and when you click on this decrease button, it's going to decrease the value of this counter by 1. So this is because when you click on this button, you're going to call the type increment, and as I said, whenever you want to update the value of the state, you need to call the action. So when you click on this button, it's going to call this first case. When you click on the second button, it's going to call the action type decrement, and this is going to call this second case, where we're going to decrease the value of the counter by 1. Now let's suppose that you want to get these values from this app component. Instead of just passing hard-coded value here, you want to get this value from this app component. So what you can do is, to this object, you can pass one more property. So just out of this increment, you can pass here a property called payload. You can specify any name to this property, but usually React developers use payload property. So we pass here payload, then specify your value. So right now I'm going to increase this counter by 5. So I'm going to pass here 5. Then I'm going to decrease the counter by 5. So pass here payload colon 5. Just out of that, you need to get these values inside the reducer. So instead of these hard-coded values, you specify here action dot payload. So inside this action, as you know, we specify property type, and we also specify here payload, which is 5. So let me just do the same for this second action dot payload. Let me save the changes, reload the browser, and when I click on this plus button, you can see it's going to increase the value of this counter by 5. And when I click on this decrease button, it's going to decrease the counter value by 5. So this is a very simple example of useReducer. If you want me to make advanced example of useReducer, then let me know in the comment section. I hope you understand how to work with useReducer. Next, we'll look at the new React hook. Now, let's talk about the next React hook, which is useRef. useRef is a built-in React hook that accepts one argument as an initial value and return the reference. So the syntax of using useRef is something like this. We call useRef and specify the initial value to it. The first argument is going to be the initial value. useRef is mutable, so you can change the value anytime you like. Now, before you use useRef in your component, you need to first import that. So at the top, you have to say import in the object, you have to say useRef from React. Now let's suppose that you want to update the value of this useRef. The initial value right now is 0. Now what if I create here a constant handle function like this? And if I say here countRef dot current, using current, you get the current value of this useRef. Right now the current value is 0. You can notice. Using this current property, you get the initial property argument value. I'm going to increase the value by 1 when I call this handler function. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say console.log and print this value, this one. And just out of that, inside this division tag, right here, I'm simply going to put a button and call the handler function to it, this one. Let me save the changes and show you the result. Now you can see here I have this click me button. When I click on this button, you can see inside my console, I'm going to get the useRef value. Whenever I click on this click me, it's going to increase the value of the initial state. The initial value is 0, and this statement is going to update this state by 1 every time when I click on this click me button. And now if we try to print a console.log message just after this handle, right down here, when I save the changes, reload the browser, I'm going to have this iRender console message. But when I click on this click me again, the component is not going to re-render. Instead, we're just going to get the updated value in the console. You also call this hook useReference. So using useReference, no re-rendering happens when the reference is updated. Let me show you a very simple example. I'm going to simply create here constant input ref is equal to useRef. And right now, I'm not going to specify any initial value to this useRef. Just so that inside my division tag, right down here, I'm going to create input of the type text, and then I'm going to specify here reference. I'm going to call here a property called ref. And to this ref, here I'm going to pass this variable input ref, something like this. And then inside this handle, right here, I'm going to say input ref, this variable, dot current, dot focus, something like this. Let me get rid of this console message, save this file, and now let me reload the browser. So when I click on this button, you can see this is going to focus on this input text box. This is because we have here a statement input reference current focus. Inside this current, we have this DOM value, and using this DOM, I'm going to focus on this input text box. Now the use reference is only able to access the element inside the useEffect hook. Let's suppose that if I console.log this input reference just out of this handle function and before this return statement, let me save the changes, reload the browser. You can see I'm going to get undefined as a response. This is because inside this use reference, before the component is mounted, we don't have anything. Instead, we have the default value of this use reference, which is undefined. So as a response, you will get undefined. Now, what if you use this console.log message inside useEffect? So at the top, what if I say here useEffect, something like this, and then print this console.log. And I'm going to just pass here a second argument as an array. Now let me import this useEffect at the top. Now let me save the changes, reload the browser, and you can see I'm going to get this input text box as a response inside my console. This is because once the component gets mounted in the UI, the useEffect hook is going to trigger, and then you will have your response back to the console. So this is a very simple example of use reference hook of React. Let's talk about the next React hook. Now let's talk about the useCallback hook. useCallback is a hook that will return a memorized version of the callback function that only changes if one of the dependencies has changed. Memorization is a way to cache a result so that it doesn't need to be computed again. This can boost your performance. To understand how useCallback works, we need to check out what problem it can solve. Let's understand a very simple example to understand how useCallback hook works in the React application. At the top right here, I'm simply going to first import React, useState, and useCallback. Just out of that, inside this app component right here, I'm simply going to create a constant useState. And I'm going to name this variable count and set count. Just out of that, I'm also going to create another useState, and I'm going to name that other counter and set other counter. Just out of that, inside this division tag right here, I'm going to create a button. So I'm going to add here a button, and then I'm going to specify onClick event on it. And this is the handler function of this button. So I'm going to just create this handler function at the top. I'm going to say here constant increment this handler function name is equal to, and then pass here the handler function. And inside this, I'm going to say set count, plus 1. I'm going to increase the value of this count variable by 1 when I click on this button. Just for that, let me do the same for decrement. Let me add here a button again with decrement handler function. Right down here, I'm going to say constant decrement is equal to, and then I'm going to pass here handler function. And here I'm going to call set count minus 1. Now just for that, let me use this state and change the value of it. So just down here, I'm going to create another button. So I'm going to add here a button, and I'm going to specify here increment with other state. And here I'm going to say increment other counter. And let me just create that function right up here. I'm going to say constant increment other counter is equal to, and then pass here a function. And inside this, I'm going to say set other counter, and then I'm going to pass here other counter plus 1. I'm using this last button to update the second state value, this one. Now just for that, inside this div, I'm going to say count colon, and in the curly braces, let me print the first state, and then I'm going to say here other count, and then I'm going to print the other count state. Let me save the changes and show you the result. When I save the changes, I'm going to have the result something like this. Let me add the statement on the next line. So let me just add that inside a division tag, something like this. Now you can see inside this app, we have two states. First for the count, and second for the other count. When we click on this increment and this decrement button, it's going to increase the value of this first count. And by using this decrement button, we are going to decrease the value of this first count. Now when I click on this increment with other state, it's going to change and update the value of this second use state. When I click on it, you can see. But the problem here is when the component re-renders, every functions inside of this component is recreated, and therefore these functions reference change between renders. We can visualize this using set data structure by adding each function to it. Why set data structure? Because it's only store unique values. So at the top, what if I say constant functions counter is equal to, and then we create a new set. Now because set used to store unique values, we use here set. And inside this set, I'm going to add all these three functions. I'm going to say here function counter dot add, and inside this add, I'm going to specify all my functions. So let me first pass this increment like this, duplicate this statement 2 more times. For the second statement, I'm going to pass decrement, and for the third statement, I'm going to pass this increment other counter. So I'm going to add all these three handler functions to this function counter. And just after that, right down here, I'm going to say console.log function counter. Now when I save the changes, you can see inside my console, I'm going to get here three functions as a response. This is the initial render of this React component. When the component is mounted in the UI, the React is going to create three functions inside this component. But when I click on this button, let's suppose that if I increase the value of this counter, React is going to re-render the component and create three more functions with new values. You can see inside this set, now we have 6 functions. If I click on this plus button again, then we are going to have 9 functions inside this set. If I click on this decrease, you're going to get the same result. Every time when the component re-render, every function inside this component is recreated. So every time when you click on these buttons, it's going to increase the function count by 3. Instead of this, what should happen instead is that if you increase one counter, all the functions related to that counter should be re-rendered. If another state value is unchanged, it should not be changed or updated. This might add performance issue. To resolve this, we can use useCallback. The syntax of useCallback is very simple. You're simply going to call useCallback and call a callback function as a first argument. And as a second argument, you specify all the dependencies. So the useCallback will return a memorized instance of the callback that only changes if one of the dependencies has changed. This means that instead of recreating the function on every re-render, we can use the same function object between renders. So instead of these callback functions, I'm going to wrap these functions inside useCallback. So let me just get rid of it. And here I'm going to call useCallback. Now at the top, I already imported this useCallback inside this import statement. So right down here, I'm going to specify parentheses. And as a first argument, you need to specify the callback function. So I'm going to pass here a callback function like this. And then as a second argument, you specify the dependencies. I will specify that later. Just for now, inside this callback function, I'm going to say set count plus 1. Using this increment, I'm going to increase the value of this count. So I'm going to do that right inside this use callback. Just after that, as a second argument, we pass here dependencies. So I'm going to pass here comma, and in the array, I'm going to pass here count. So every time the count changes, I want to execute this callback. Let me do the same thing for this decrement. Let me copy and paste the code here to save some time. Just after that, I'm going to do the same for this last one as well. Like this. I'm going to call here use callback, and then inside this dependencies, I'm going to pass this other counter as a dependencies. So whenever the value of this other counter changes, only then this callback function is going to execute. Let me save the changes and show you the result. Let me reload my browser, and now when I click on this plus button, you can see I'm going to get 5 as a response. This is because this is only going to create 2 more functions, this increment and this decrement. This is because we are changing the value of this count variable. Every time when I change the dependencies, this use callback is going to execute this callback function. If I click on this increment with other state, you can see I'm only going to get here 6. So only one function is created inside this set. If you want to just count these functions, then you can just call here dot size. Save the changes, reload the browser, and now you can see this is going to return 3 functions. When I click on this increment with other state, I'm going to get 4 as a response. So it's going to create only one function rather creating both these functions. This is because we are just changing the value of this second state. The value of this first state remains the same. And now if we remove these dependencies right from this callback function, let me show you what would happen. Let me reload the browser, and when I click on this plus button, it's going to return 3. But when I click on this plus button again, it's not going to change the value because the dependencies are empty. So this will improve your application performance. So I hope you understand how to work with the use callback hook in React. Let's talk about the next React hook. Now let's understand what is the use of useImperatievHandle hook in the React application. useImperativeHandle is used with the use reference, or you can say with reference. And as you know, the reference is just a way to control the DOM element in the React. In the previous examples, we understand how we can use useRef. The useImperativeHandle lets you to modify the reference instance that is exposed from parent component when using useReference, or you can say when using reference. The useImperativeHandle syntax something look like this. It's going to take reference as a first argument, create handle as a second argument, and dependencies as a third argument. This reference is used to pass down from parent component. Then we have create handle. This argument is the value to be exposed to the parent component. Then we have the dependencies, the array of value that causes the hook to rerun when changes. So whenever the dependency change, it's going to execute this create handle. Now let's understand how we can use this hook in the React application. Instead of accessing element via vanilla JavaScript, we instead use useReference so that we can ensure the React has control over this element. In React, we can pass reference to other components using higher order component. This is what we call forward reference. For example, let's say you have an element that you need to track whenever it gets clicked on. In that case, you could use useImperativeHandle hook. You could use useImperativeHandle to override the native click event to do this. Let me show you a very simple example of it. I'm going to first import the React, and inside an object, I'm going to import useRef, useImperativeHandle, and forward reference. And I'm using all these hooks inside this example. Just for that, right down here, I'm going to say constant input ref is equal to useRef. And just for that, inside this division tag, right down here, I'm going to call my child component. So let me just create that child component right down here. I'm going to say constant child is equal to, and then I'm going to pass my function here. And just for that, I'm going to say here constant input is equal to useRef. And then inside the child component, I'm going to return a division tag. And inside that div, I'm going to say input type text. Then I'm going to call here reference. And for the reference, I'm going to pass this input, this one. Just after that, if you want to specify any property to this input element, you can pass that property right to this child, and then you can pass your properties from the parent component. So inside this, I can simply pass props and ref. You can see how we specify the second parameter. Using this ref, we are going to reference this input text box. So whenever we click on this input text box, I want to execute a function inside this parent component. Let me show you that later. Just for now, I'm going to pass this reference, and inside this, right here to this input, I'm going to pass all the properties. So I'm going to spread all the properties here using spread operator. I'm going to say here props, something like this, and let me specify placeholder here. Placeholder is going to be type here. So this is a very simple input text box. Just after that, let me call this child inside my parent component right here. Let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have this input type text here. Now what I want when I click on this input text box, I want to execute a callback function. But instead of adding any event inside this child, I want to get an event from this parent component and reference my input text box using this useRef. So what I'm simply going to do is right here, I'm going to say onFocus is equal to, and then pass here curly braces. And inside this, I'm simply going to call the callback function. And here I'm going to say input ref dot current dot focus. Just after that, I'm going to specify the second property with ref equal to, and inside this, I'm going to pass here input. So both these properties are now passed to this input text box because we already specify here props. You can notice using this spread operator, we pass all the properties to this input text box from the parent component. So now this is not going to do anything. It's going to return an error message. Cannot read property of null, because right now this property is null, because this is not going to reference any input text box. Now what I want to reference the child component input text box from this parent component. So what I'm going to do is I can use here useImperativeHandle hook. So right down here inside this child, I can specify useImperativeHandle as a first argument. We need to specify the reference. So we call here ref, this property. And as you know, to this property, we have here input ref, this one. So this is going to initialize this reference as this input text box. So start that as a second argument, you call the callback function. So I'm going to pass here a callback function, something like this. And then what I have to do is I have to return something from this function. So instead of curly braces, I'm going to pass here parentheses, and inside that, I'm going to call curly braces. And then I'm going to call a property, which is focus, colon, call the callback function. And then I'm going to say console.log input is in focus. Let me save the changes, and you're going to get an error inside your console. When you scroll up, you can notice you're going to have this warning. Function components cannot be given reference. Attempt to access this reference will fail. Do you mean to use React forward ref? So this warning says that we need to use forward ref to access the child input inside the parent component. Forward ref is nothing but a simple helper function of React. So as I said, in React, we can pass reference to other component using higher order components. And for that, we are using forward reference. So what you have to do is, I'm going to grab this component inside this forward ref. So at the top, we already have this forward ref imported at the top. So I'm just going to say here forward ref, and inside this parenthesis, I'm going to put my function. Reload my browser, and now you're not going to get any error. And now if I click on this type here, you can see I'm going to get here console message. Input is in focus. So this useImperativeHandle is going to reference to this parent component events. So whenever the event happen in the parent component, this hook is going to execute this callback function. And then if you want to specify any dependencies to this imperative hook, then you can do that by passing a third argument to this function. That's upon you. So this is the simple use of using useImperativeHandle in the React application. Let's talk about the next React hook. Now let's talk about the useMemo hook of React. useMemo in React is essential React hook for improving the performance and speed of your application by caching the output in the computer memory and returning it when the same input is given again. The syntax is very simple. We are going to call useMemo hook and then call two arguments. First is a function compute that computes the result, and second is the dependency array. By default, the useMemo hook will execute the function you pass as an argument after the initial render. The useCallback hook is similar to useMemo, but useCallback returns memorize function, while the useMemo has a function that returns a value. Let me show you a very simple example. So at the top, I'm going to import useEffect, useState, and useMemo. We are going to import that from the React module. Then inside this app, I'm simply going to create a state with counter and set counter. And then I'm going to return a JSX with division tag. And inside this div, I'm going to first call the button, and to this button we specify this set counter, and we're going to increase this counter value by 1 whenever we click on this button. And inside this button we are going to print this counter value. I'm going to create a child component. So right down here I'm going to say constant child is equal to, and then call a function here. And inside this function I'm going to call useEffect hook, and I'm going to print console.log message. And inside this I'm going to return a division tag, and inside this div I'm going to add one heading tag and say this is a child component. Save this file. You can see I'm going to have the result something like this. Just out of that, let me call this child inside my parent component. So before this button, here I'm going to add my child component. Let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have the child and the parent component. Let me open my console, and now when I reload the browser, I'm going to have here a text user card render, or you can change this to child render, something like this. And inside the parent component right up here, I'm also going to call the useEffect hook to render some console message. I'm going to say here console.log, and I'm going to print here parent render. And now you can see first the child render and then the parent component render. But you can notice now when I click on this click me button and increase the value of this count, you can see the React is going to re-render the child component as well as the parent component. But you can notice here, I'm just changing the value of the parent component. This will execute the child component unnecessarily. We can remove this unnecessary render from this parent component and boost the application performance. To do that, we can use useMemo. So I'm going to import the useMemo inside these parentheses, and just down here, just out of this useEffect, right down here, I'm going to say constant memorize is equal to useMemo, and inside this I'm going to call the callback function as a first argument, and then inside it I'm going to return this child component. And instead of the child component, right now I'm simply going to print this memorize value. Now just out of that, once you have your callback function, as a second argument here we are going to pass an array. Inside this array we are not going to pass anything. We're just going to pass here empty array as a dependencies. So we are informing React that this function, it depends on this array. Right now I don't have any value here. Let me just save the changes, reload the browser. When I click on this click me button, you can see it's just going to print the parent component, and we are not going to have this console message of this child component. And right now the value of this function is now memorized. React won't execute this function until the value of this function changes. Let me show you. What if I create here new state like this? I'm going to specify this other counter as a dependency to this useMemo right here. And just out of this button, I'm going to create another button, and then I'm going to specify here click me and specify this other counter, this one. And when I click on this button, I'm going to increase the value of this other counter. Now what if I save the changes and reload the browser? I'm going to have here two buttons. When I click on the first button, it's going to re-render the parent component. But when I click on this second button, it's going to re-render the child component as well as the parent component. Because as you know, the child component is in the parent component. So whenever the child component changes, React need to re-render the parent component as well. But when the parent component changes, React don't need to update the child component. So when you click on this first button, React won't re-render the child component. You can notice. So using this technique, you can improve your application performance. So I hope you understand how to work with useMemo in React application. Next, we'll talk about the useLayoutEffect hook. Now let's understand the useLayoutEffect hook of React. useLayoutEffect hook is very useful for DOM updates. We can use it for DOM measurements, just like the scroll position or style for a specific element. The useLayoutEffect hook works synchronously. So it runs immediately after the React has performed all DOM mutation. It will run after every render but before the screen is updated. useEffect and useLayoutEffect share the same function signatures, meaning the API exposed to the developer are similar in both cases. So if you compare the useEffect hook and the useLayoutEffect hook, then you can notice both share the same signature. Both have the same syntax. We have the hook name, and as a first argument, we are going to have the callback function. This callback function is executed when the component is mounted in the UI, and using this useLayout hook, this callback function is going to execute when the component is mounted in the UI, but before the screen is updated. Now, it is worth noticing that which function execute first. Can you answer this question? Which function execute first? Let's understand. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to convert this useEffect into a simple useEffect hook, and then I'm going to call here useEffect layout. And inside both these hooks, we are going to have this console.log message. And don't forget to import both these functions at the top. So here I'm going to call import useEffect, useState, useLayoutEffect. Just out of that, I'm going to save all the changes. When I save this, you can see first the useLayoutEffect is going to execute, and then we have the useEffect. Now, because useLayoutEffect is executed before the screen is updated, that is why we have this hook console message before this useEffect. Let me show you a very simple example. At the top, let's suppose if I create a constant variable with useState, and inside this div right here, I'm going to add a button, and to this callback function, I'm going to change the value of the set name. So I'm going to just call here set name and change the value of this name variable. When I save the changes, reload the browser, first we have the useLayoutEffect, and then we have useEffect. When I click on this state update, when I update this state, let me show you what would be the result. When I click on the state update, we are going to have the same result, because first React is going to update the screen and mount the component in the UI. So we have this useLayout first, and then we have this useEffect. And if you specify here dependency, something like this, then this hook is only going to execute once. Let me save the changes, reload the browser, and when I click on the state update, you can see it's only going to call the useEffect hook. This is because we have here a dependency. And now if I specify here name as a dependency, then whenever the value of this name changes, we're going to have this useLayout hook in the console. Let me reload and change the value of this state. You can see we're going to have this useLayout as a response. Now let's suppose that you want to repaint the UI and change the name. In that case, I'm simply going to call if and else condition right inside this useLayoutEffect right here, and then I'm going to say set name John, and I'm going to change the value of this state. Let me just remove this name right from here. I try to print here h1 name like this, save the changes. When I reload the browser, I'm going to have John inside my UI. So there is not a big difference between useEffect and useLayout. I have a detailed video on useEffect. You can check out that video from the top right corner of the screen or from the description. Just for now, let's understand the next step. Now, let's talk about the useTransition hook of React. useTransition hook used to prioritize UI updates. Sometimes some UI updates should be performed as quickly as possible, while others can have lower priority. For example, typing an input field would be more important than filtering the list. So you specify priority to the input field first, and then for filtering the list. The useTransition hook allows you to specify some state updates as not as important. This state update executes in parallel with other state updates, but the rendering of this component will not wait for this less important state update. Let me show you a very simple example of useTransition. So at the top here, I'm going to say constant, and in the array, I'm going to destructure two variables. First is pending, and second is start transition. Pending is a variable and start transition is a function. Now let me first import this at the top. So I'm going to copy this, and right up here, I'm going to say import. In the object, I'm going to say use transition and use state from React. So just out of this constant use transition, I'm going to say constant count and set count is equal to use state, and the initial value of this use state is 0. Just out of that, right down here, I'm also going to use useEffect. So at the top, I'm going to say useEffect, and right down here, I'm going to say useEffect. In the parentheses, I'm going to specify an argument, and as a first argument, I'm going to specify the callback function, and then here I'm going to say console.log in the double quote use state trigger. And right down here, I'm going to say function handle click, and this is a type of handler function. So inside this div, I'm simply going to call a button. So instead of this app, I'm going to call my button here. And to this button, I'm going to specify text count number and then print my number here. And just out of that, to this button, I'm going to specify on click event. Inside this handler function, I'm simply going to call this useTransition. To call this useTransition, I'm going to say here start transition, this function. And inside that, you're going to call a function, something like this. And then I'm going to say here console.log and say useTransition trigger. Now let me save the changes and open my console. You can see in the console, I'm going to get useState trigger. This is because when the component is mounted, this useEffect is going to execute. Now when I click on this button, you can see it's going to execute this useTransition hook. And after that, you're going to have useState. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to pass here the second argument to this useEffect, and inside an array, I'm going to pass count. Just so that when I click on this handle click, I'm going to change the value of this count variable. I'm going to call here set count and say count plus 1. So I'm going to increase the value of this count by 1 when I click on this handler function. Reload the browser. When I click on this count number, it's going to execute useTransition and then execute the useState. It means when the component is mounted in the UI, first the useTransition execute and then the useState execute. So whenever you want to do some extra work before the state updates, you can do that inside this start transition. Now just for that, let me show you one more example. At the top, what if I create here an object? So I'm going to say here constant large list is equal to, and I'm going to pass here an array of object. So I'm going to copy an array of object and specify that right inside this array. Just suppose that this is a very large object, and then I'm going to specify this large object to this useState, this one. I'm going to change the name of the state variables to list and setList. And then I'm also going to call here another useState and then specify here name and setName. And then I'm going to specify the initial value to this useState. Just out of that, let me get rid of this useEffect right from here. And inside this handle click, I'm going to first call setName, this setName useState function, and then call here e.target.value. So I'm going to get the value from the event target and value property. So what I have to do is I have to pass this handle click to the input element. So instead of handle click, I'm going to change this to handle change. Copy this, and then I'm going to pass this to the input element. So right down here, instead of this button, I'm going to say here input of type text, and then I'm going to specify value name, this variable, and I'm going to specify here on change is equal to, and then I'm going to specify this handle change. So whenever I type anything inside this input text box, I'm going to pass that value to this name variable. And then I'm going to get rid of this set count right from here. Save the changes. Yeah, we need to specify here event parameter. Save this. So I'm going to have the result something like this. Reload my browser. Just so that when I type something here, I'm going to have false as a response from this console.log. If I console.log right up here, save the changes, reload the browser. Now the default value of spending is false. But when I change something inside this input text box, let's suppose if I type here A, you can see suddenly the value changes to true. And we have here true inside this spending. This is because the default value of this spending is false. But when you call this start transition, it's going to change that value to true because this callback function needs to be executed before this useState. So useTransition will automatically change that false value to true, and you're going to have true inside this pending variable. Now what you can do is inside your UI right here, you can simply say if, you can call here curly braces, and here you can say is pending. If it is true, then return a division tag with loading message. Or if it is false, then you can print your list. So I'm simply going to say here list this variable dot map. I'm going to call the JavaScript function map, and then I'm going to say here item, call the callback function and say here div. Here I'm going to pass first key item dot id, and inside this div I'm going to say in the curly braces item dot product. Let me save the changes and show you the result. Reload the browser. I'm going to have the list of product inside my UI right here. You can notice. Save this. Now if I type something here, you can see behind the scene the transition is happening and you will have this loading value as a response. Now what if inside this start transition here, if I say set list, I'm going to change and specify the value to this list. When I type something inside this input text box, if I say here large list is object dot filter, and I'm going to filter the input value. So I'm going to say here item, and then here I'm going to say item dot product dot includes, if it is includes event dot target dot value, then return that. So let me just save the changes, reload the browser, and now if I type here hand, you can see it's going to filter the value. But the difference is before we specify the value to this use state, I'm going to change that value and specify that to this list using this transition. So there is nothing special about this hook, but you can use this hook to specify priority to your UI components. So I hope you understand how to work with the use transition in the React application. Next, let's understand how you can use useDeferredValue hook in the React application. Now let's understand how to use useDeferredValue hook in the React application. By default, React always render a consistent UI. Usually when update the state, we expect to see changes on the screen without any delay to make the app feel more responsive and giving us a better user experience. However, sometimes it might be useful to intentionally introduce an inconsistency. In React, rendering is synchronous. Each rendering component triggered by the state changes. Each rendering component triggered by a state changes would have to wait for all the others to be ready to be updated. So let's suppose that you have two states inside your React component. React will wait for both these states to update and then re-render the component, instead of rendering the component multiple times when we have multiple use states. With React 18, different priorities can be given to each state changes or even to each component rendering. Using useDeferredValue hook, you can access the previous value of the state as well. Let me show you a very simple example. I'm going to create a constant counter and set counter, and I'm going to create both these variables using this useState hook. The default value is 0. Now at the top, let me first import this useState. So in the import statement, I'm going to say useState from React, and then inside this useState right here, I'm also going to call useDeferredValue. Just out of that, I'm going to call this useDeferredValue just out of this useState. Here I'm going to say constant, then I'm going to specify here defer counter is equal to, and then specify here useDeferredValue, and then as a first argument I'm going to specify this counter, this state value. Let's suppose if I call here useEffect, and inside this useEffect, if I call the callback function and print this counter using console.log, and also print the defer value using console.log. Let me save the changes and show you the result. When I save the changes, you can see first we're going to have this counter value, and then we have the deferred counter value. But when I change the value of this counter, let me show you what would happen. So instead of this app, if I call here a button with onClick event, and then I'm going to specify here set counter and increase the value of this counter variable by 1. Let me reload the browser. And now when I click on this increment button, you can see I'm going to have the result something like this. So this useEffect is going to first print the counter value, which is increased by 1. Then it's going to return the previous counter value, or you can say the defer value. So right now inside this defer value we have 0. Then it's going to return the counter value again, and then return the current defer value. So using this useDeferredValue, you can access the previous value of your state. So let's suppose that if I print here a division tag with the advanced counter defer value, and after that if I print the counter value right here, basic counter value, and then specify the counter, let me save the changes, and when I click on this increment, you can't actually see that effect, but you can see in the console inside this defer counter value you have the previous state value, and then it's going to update it to the latest value. You can use this useDeferredValue hook mostly when you want to keep your interface responsive, when you have something that renders immediately based on the user input and something that needs to be wait for the data fetch. So let's suppose that you want to fetch your data from the backend, but that data, it depends on the user input. In that case, you can use this useDeferredValue. So once you get your data from the backend, you can then call this useDeferredValue and print your UI and make your component completely responsive. So I hope you understand how to work with this useDeferredValue hook in React application. Let's understand the next React hook. Now, let's understand how to use useId in the React application. useId is a hook for generating unique IDs that are stable across the server and client. We use useId hook only for joining two HTML elements. To understand useId, let me just show you a very simple example. I'm simply going to create a label and input text box inside this division tag. And then I'm going to specify HTML for yes to this label, and to this input text box, I'm going to specify ID yes. So the ID of both these elements are same. So whenever you try to click on this label, it's going to check this checkbox. Let me just save the changes and show you the result first. When I save the changes, I'm going to have here, do you like daily tuition? And here I'm going to have my checkbox. I can click on this checkbox directly, or by clicking on this label, I can check this checkbox. You can notice. This is because we have the input checkbox ID to this HTML4 attribute. Now let's suppose that we have the same thing inside a component. So for example, let's suppose if I create here a function with checkbox name. Now this is a type of component. I'm going to specify here return statement and return a simple division tag and return a simple this label and this input checkbox, something like this. And then inside my app, right up here, I'm going to copy this checkbox just like this and save the changes. This will not do anything. This will work fine. But the problem comes in when you add another checkbox. So if you duplicate this component, save the changes, and you can see right now I have two input checkbox here. Let me reload the browser. And now when I click on this second label, it's going to check the first checkbox. This is the problem, right? I have to check my second checkbox when I click on the second label. This will happen because we have the same ID to both these input labels. You can see all the elements have the same IDs. So what we need to do is we have to specify the unique IDs to all these input elements to work this form properly. So now to solve this, we have this useId hook. So at the top, I'm going to say import. In the object, I'm going to import useId from React. And right down here, I'm going to say constant ID is equal to useId. That's it. This is a very simple syntax of this useId hook. This ID is going to generate unique IDs inside this ID variable. You can specify any name to this variable, that's upon you. And then you can pass this ID to these labels. So instead of this yes, I can now simply pass this ID, something like this. And as you know, I don't have this ID inside this component. So let me grab this and specify that inside this checkbox. Let me save the changes, reload the browser. And now when I click on the second label, it's going to check the second checkbox. And when I click on the first label, it's going to check the first checkbox. Now, if I try to console.log this ID, if I say here console.log ID on the console, so inside this ID, we have this unique value. So this useId hook is going to return a string that includes the colon, string, and a colon. Keep in mind, this string is not supported in the CSS selector. useRid generates a string that includes the colon token. This helps you to ensure that the token is unique but not supported in the CSS selector. Just for that, let's suppose that you have multiple checkboxes. So for example, let's suppose inside this component, let me copy both this element and paste that right down here. We have these multiple components here. Now let me save the changes. And now when I click on this last checkbox, you can see we have the same problem again. If you open your console, then you can notice here, we have only two unique values. And we have 4 elements inside this form. To solve this, you can create another object, something like this with new value. So I'm going to create here ID1 and specify that to this second elements. Save the changes. It will generate new IDs. So now this will work fine. You can notice. This will solve the problem, but this is not the best practice to solve the problem because when you have multiple input elements, you won't create multiple objects. Let's suppose in case you have more than one input text box. In that case, you have to create multiple instances of this useId. So instead of doing this, you can pass suffix to the element with ID. So let me get rid of this like this. Right from here, let me get rid of this console. And now instead of just ID, here I'm going to pass template string and pass here $. In the curly braces, I'm going to pass this ID, specify here hyphen, and specify here name. So I'm going to specify my own value to this ID. I'm going to do the same right here. So I'm going to copy this and specify that right here. And then I'm going to change this to email. So let's suppose that this label is for email. So I'm going to copy and specify here email. Do the same for this input text box. Let me save the changes. And when I click on these labels, you can see it's going to work fine. So this is the very simple use of this useId hook in React. Next, we'll talk about the useSyncExternalStore hook in React application. Now, let's understand how to use useSyncExternalStore hook in the React application. useSyncExternalStore is a hook recommended for reading and subscribing from external data source. The syntax of this hook is something like this. We have the useSyncExternalStore, and to this useSyncExternalStore, we have 3 arguments. First is subscribe, second is get snapshot, and third is get server snapshot. The first argument is a function to register a callback that is called whenever the store changes. This second argument is a function that returns the current value of the store. And this third argument that returns the snapshot used during the server rendering. And this is actually the optional parameter. This method is return a value of the store. So let me show you a very simple example. So what we're going to do is we're going to first import this hook at the top. So I'm going to say here import in the object. I'm going to say useSyncExternalStore from React. And then right down here, I'm going to say constant width is equal to, and then specify this hook useSyncExternalStore. As a first argument, as I said, subscribe is a callback function. So I'm going to pass here a callback function, something like this. To the second argument, we specify the current value of the store. I'm simply going to pass a window dot inner width. I'm going to get the value from this window and pass the inner width value to this second argument. Just out of that, as a third argument, I'm not going to pass anything. So let me get rid of this, just like this. And as I said, this second argument is also a type of function. So let me get rid of this and call here the arrow function. Just out of that, to the first argument, right here, inside this first argument, I'm simply going to say window.add event listener, and I'm going to add the event to this window, which is resize. So whenever I resize the window, I'm going to call this event. Just out of that, as a listener, I'm going to call a function here. So the function I'm going to get is from this parameter. So I'm going to say here listener and pass that function right here as a callback function to this resize. And then I'm going to return a function with window.remove event listener resize and then call this listener. And just out of that, instead of this app, I'm going to replace this and I'm going to pass this with inside this paragraph. Let me save the changes and show you the result. When I save the changes, I'm going to get the size of the window as a response. Now when I inspect this and when I click on this device and when I change the size of this window, you can see it's going to listen to the resize event and change the value of this width variable. So whenever I change this window, it's going to call this listener. So this first argument is register a callback function for the window resize event listener. So whenever I resize this window, the first argument is going to subscribe to that event listener. And then we have the second argument. This is going to return the current browser window width to this width variable. And then I'm going to have the response what I want. So using this hook, you can sync your backend data with frontend. So you will have your up-to-date component. So I hope you understand how you can basically use this useSyncExternalStore hook in the React application. Next, we'll talk about the next React hook. Now, once you understand all the important hooks of React, let's take a look at how you can create your own custom hook in the React application. A custom hook is a JavaScript function that begins with use. It is not mandatory to begin a custom hook name with use, but without it, React would be unable to check for violation of the hook's rules automatically. Therefore, it is important to follow that naming convention. Hook is just like a React component, but with some more features. Building your own hook lets you to extract component logic into reusable functions. Let me show you A very simple example. At the top, let me first import the use state because we are using use state in the hook. And then inside this component, inside this app component right here, I'm going to say constant toggle and set toggle and then specify the initial value to the state, which is false. And inside this return statement, inside this div, I'm going to first add h1 heading tag and then specify here use state and this toggle value. Just after that, I'm going to create a button just down here and specify onClick event on it. You can see the onClick event is going to call this set toggle function. And I'm going to invert the value of this toggle by clicking on this button. This is a very simple use of this use state. Let me just save the changes. I'm going to have the result something like this. When I click on this toggle state, it's going to change the value of the state. You can notice. Now, let's suppose that I want to use this component feature in my other component. In that case, I can create a custom hook. I can share the same logic using reusable functions. So let me just create a custom hook right down here. I'm going to create a custom hook. So let me just name this custom hook toggle. I'm going to say constant use toggle. As I said, to create a custom hook, you need to start your function with use name. So we have this use and the function name, which is toggle, is equal to, and then we specify here the arrow function. Just for that, to this arrow function, I'm going to specify the initial value. As you know, here we have the parameter to specify initial value to the state. So we create here initial value parameter. Right inside this parenthesis, I'm going to pass parameter to this use toggle hook. So I'm going to say here initial state. And then if you want, you can specify default value to this initial state as well. So I'm going to specify default value here false. So if you forgot to specify argument to this use toggle hook, then we have this default value to this initial state. Just for that, right here, I'm going to say constant in the array call toggle and set toggle is equal to and call use state hook here. Inside the custom hook, you can call any React built-in hook. So I'm going to call here use state. And here the default value is the initial value. So I'm going to pass this initial state here. Just for that, right down here, you can return an array with toggle and set toggle. And now you can use this toggle and this set toggle in your component. So what you have to do is you have to call this use toggle and specify that instead of this use state, something like this. Now when you save the changes, click on this toggle button, you can see you're going to have the same result, but with custom hook. Now let me just enhance this example. We can wrap this set toggle into a use callback function. So right down here, I can say constant toggle change is equal to use callback. Keep in mind, you have to import this use callback at the top right here, and then you can call this use callback inside your hook. Just for that, as you know, this use callback will return the memoized version of the callback that only changes if one of the input has changed. It means this callback function is only going to execute when the value of the toggle changes. Otherwise, it will not going to return anything. So this will improve the application performance. I'm going to call a callback function and say set toggle and then pass here toggle, an arrow function, and then invert the value. So instead of inverting the value inside this component, I'm going to invert the toggle value inside the user, inside the custom hook. Just after that, once you've done that, you can copy this toggle change and specify that right here. And instead of this set toggle, you can call toggle change and then specify that to this onClick. So instead of this callback function, you can just directly specify toggle change. Now when I save the changes, click on this button, you can see I'm going to have the same result, but with the custom hook. Now you can use this custom hook anywhere in any component. If you want to add a toggle feature to your component, you just have to add this one statement and that will add this feature to your component. Now the main advantage of React Hook is reusability of stateful logic. Now let me show you one more example. Now let's suppose that you want to filter a list of users. So for example, at the top, let's suppose that you have a list of users. You can get this list from the backend as well. That's upon you. I'm going to have a simple array of object and we have some values here. Just for that, what I want to filter this list when I click on this button. I'm simply going to back to my hook right down here, and then I'm going to change these values. I'm going to say here friend and set friend. And then I'm going to call here useState and the initial value. Right now the initial value is empty array. So I'm going to pass empty array here. Just for that, inside this use callback, right here, instead of this set toggle, I'm going to get rid of this. Here a function, something like this. And then inside this use callback, I'm simply going to call this friend dot filter. I'm using JavaScript filter method to filter the object. And then inside it, I'm going to say obj, iterate over all this object, and then get obj.name if it is equal to this argument value. So to this callback right here, if I specify parameter name here, and then if the object.name, if it is equal to name, then return that to this set friends. So let me copy this and then specify that right here. And I'm going to grab this statement and specify that inside this parenthesis. And just for that, I also want to pass the second argument to this use callback. So I'm going to pass here comma and pass an array. So I'm just informing React that this callback is not depends on anything. If you want, you can pass this initial value right here as well. That's upon you. Just for that, instead of this toggle change, now I'm going to say here filter change. And just for that, instead of toggle, right now I'm going to say here friend and call here filter change and specify that right here. So this is a very simple hook. Now just for that, let me save the changes and back to the app.js right here. What I want to call this hook. So now instead of use toggle, I'm going to name this use filter. And now what you have to do is you have to copy this use filter and specify that right here. So you have to just call the use filter hook function and then specify the initial value to it. As you know, the initial value is empty array. So we have this array here, array of object. I'm going to pass that right here, friend list. So this will just initialize this value with this friend list. Just for that, it will iterate over that value and return with this array. Copy this array and specify that right here. I'm going to get both these values. And just for that, let me get rid of this. And inside a console.log, I'm simply going to print this friend. And inside this onClick, I'm going to specify this filter change. So let me get rid of this, call here a function, specify filter change, and inside this parenthesis, as you know, we have this name. So we have to pass value here. So in the single quote, I'm going to specify here this third value. Now let me save the changes. Now let me open the console. Right now, I have 3 arrays inside this object. But when I click on this toggle state, you can see I'm going to have the filter array from this hook. So this is going to filter the array and return third object from this list. You're not limited to only use this for filtering the array or using toggle change in your component. Instead, you can do many things with custom hook, just like fetching backend data and display it on the front end, add event listener, passing information between hooks, and much more. So you can do many things with custom hook. So I hope you understand how to create a custom hook in the React application. That's it. I cover all the important hooks and a custom hook of React 18. If you find anything useful, make sure to press the like button, share this video with your friends, subscribe for more latest videos. That is all for now. I will see you in the next one.